So in Java there are basically two types of exceptions. The two types of exceptions that we have are checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions. And these two types of exceptions kind of exist in Java for some reasons that are kind of a little bit debated. And as we talk about the checked exception, you will kind of see what I'm talking about, but just so you are aware, this is kind of a unique thing for Java. And I don't really know of other programming languages that have checked and unchecked exceptions. And because of this, it creates some division and some confusion for Java developers. But I'm going to try to explain the purpose of each one of these exception types and generally how you use them. So let's talk a little bit about checked exceptions first. So a checked exception basically is an exception that either needs to be cut. You have to have some catch in your method wherever that exception can be thrown. It must be cut. Or you have to specify that your method couldn't throw that exception, which then places that burden of being cut on whatever calls your method. So this basically works to set up a rule that a checked exception has to be handled. You have to do something specifically with it. You can't just ignore it. And so a checked exception really forces error handling into your code. It really forces you to deal with exceptions. And this is somewhat debated because it kind of forces your hand. Like I said, you have to deal with the exception. It can be a little bit of overhead in Java. A lot of times you just want to open a file and you don't want to deal with an exception. But because of the way that checked exceptions work in Java, the compiler won't even compile your code. It will give you an error if you haven't put some code that could potentially throw a checked exception in a try block, or you haven't made it so that you declare that your method can throw that exception and then it ends up getting throw up the chain. It's a very formal way of dealing with exceptions, and kind of the idea behind this was to ensure that the proper conditions were checked. That error handling existed in the code. It kind of made it so that the compiler could do a better job of determining whether or not your code was handling the conditions that could happen. And checked exceptions are all basically subclasses from exception. If we look at this diagram here, you can see this is kind of the hierarchy of exceptions in Java. Everything inherits from throwable, every exception type. And from here you have error and you also have exception. And the ones that I have in red here are ones that are checked exceptions. So there is kind of this exception to the exceptions, which is basically everything that inherits from exception is checked, including exception itself. But runtime exception, anything that inherits from runtime exception is not checked. So all of the red area on this diagram are checked exceptions, and that means that you must either catch them or specify that your method is going to throw that exception type. So if you created new exceptions in Java and you wanted to create checked exceptions, you would basically inherit from exception. And when you are creating exceptions or when you are dealing with exceptions, the rule to remember with checked exceptions are checked exceptions, are any kind of exception that code will be reasonably expected to handle. So it's an error condition where your code should be able to do something useful. And a good example of that would be if you try to open up a file but that file doesn't exist. Well, I mean, you could detect that condition. You could reasonably give the user an error message saying that file didn't exist. Contrast this to your program run out of memory, or you try to reference some object that didn't exist or wasn't initialized as a null pointer exception. In that case, you can't really reasonably expect it to handle that because you couldn't really have known that was going to happen. And even if you did, you don't have any good response to do when that does happen. So now let's talk about unchecked exceptions. So this is kind of the opposite. Unchecked exceptions are just like regular exceptions in most programming languages. If you are familiar with C++ or C#, they are unchecked. all the exceptions in those languages are unchecked. And unchecked exceptions kind of have another rule with them, which is basically there is two causes of unchecked exceptions. There is the ones, if you see on this hierarchy, that inherits from throwable error or inherit from error. On that error side of this, these are things that you should not catch. As a general rule, you should never catch an error because these are critical errors that should halt the program. These are things like you are run out of memory, things that you really shouldn't be able to do anything about. On the other side of that, we have this runtime exception that inherits from exception. Anything that inherits from runtime exception is an unchecked exception. So you don't have to deal with it, but it's something that you should have to deal with. But you could. And you know, a good example of this would be things like a null pointer reference. You could possibly do something there. It's not ridiculous to catch that exception if you had some login or something that makes sense. But in general, you are not going to be able to catch runtime exceptions. Otherwise, you would have to put try catch blocks all throughout your code because they could pop up anywhere. So it's not something that is reasonably expected that your code should be able to handle, but it's something that your code, it might be able to handle. So that's kind of the general rule behind that. And as we have kind of already covered by talking about that, this hierarchy, you can see that all of the green boxes here are things that are unchecked exceptions. So, and really throwable, you shouldn't inherit from directly because that's kind of a no-no. It's not expected that anyone would inherit from throwable. You either inherit from error or runtime exception or exception. So with that said, if you have an error, a runtime exception, or anything that inherits from those are basically going to be unchecked exceptions, and they don't have the rule that you have to catch them, or you have to specify that you throw that exception type.